Asia's monarchies defy history. In a modern era of democracy, worlds of tradition, mystery, and ritual command fascination and respect like never before. Asian monarchs are symbols of continuity, living connections to the past that are often loved and loathed in equal measure. On the northern coast of the world's third biggest island, Borneo, there lies one of the world's smallest kingdoms. Brunei owes its extraordinary existence to the fact that it's had a sultan as a monarch for the last 600 years. However, unlike the rest of Asia and most of the world, Brunei remains an absolute monarchy, where the sultan is head of state, as well as head of the government. The sultan is seen as divine. Even his own cabinet ministers revere him. Brunei is known throughout the world not only for its sultan, but also for its oil. The royal family has become astronomically wealthy and has shared that wealth amongst the small population. But in Brunei, you're not supposed to discuss it.
Talking about wealth, Brunei's money is a taboo in this country. It's constitutionally banned.
The monarch has a grip over his people like nowhere else in Asia. It's a system that is hard to understand from a westernized democratic perspective.
That kind of system suits Brunei.
Whether Brunei under the Sultan is a friend of British values is, I think, a rather different question.
But is the system sustainable? What happens to the Sultan and to Brunei when the oil runs out? And can this tiny state resist democracy when so many of its neighbors have embraced it? Brunei is one of only 6 countries left in the world that have retained systems of absolute monarchy. Power is centralized and hierarchical. Political parties and elections almost non-existent. Brunei has been a sultanate ever since Muslim traders established themselves here in the 14th century. His Majesty Sultan Haji Hassan al-Bolkiah Musaidin Wadawla is Brunei's 29th sovereign. As a country, Brunei would have disappeared entirely in the 19th and 20th centuries if it hadn't been protected by Britain. They set up a residency system that ensured the country wasn't taken over by Malaysia.
The sultans those days was really hard up. There was not much money. Even the sultans wanted to go to Singapore, for example. They had to borrow money from the British.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the sultans of Brunei were said to be so poor, their clothes were threadbare and their palaces meager. The Brunei economy changed forever in 1929, after the discovery of oil by Shell Petroleum. However, the sultans weren't allowed to share the wealth that was being created at an astonishing rate.
Nothing went to the Sultan at the time because according to the residency agreement, he was entitled for a monthly stipend. Say, for example, 6,000 States dollars. They were not given direct money.
The current sultan's father, Omar Ali Saifuddin III, subtly changed the relationship with the British over the course of his reign, so that Bruneians were able to share the extraordinary wealth that was being created. By the 1980s, the Sultan of Brunei had earned enough money from oil exports to be dubbed the richest man in the world, largely because the line between his personal assets and the country's had become so blurred. With unimaginable, not to say unmentionable wealth, the Sultan's position seemed secure. But if 95% of Brunei's income comes from oil and gas, what happens when these resources eventually run out?
From 1935, when the oil was discovered, this British threw out the theory that within 25 years, Brunei oil will be dried up. I hear the story when I came 21 years ago. By God's will, I hope oil wealth will go on and go on forever unless someone else discover another source of energy.
Oil and gas won't last forever. So it's very important that the country's investments are developed. It benefits because it is a small country, small population. So if the investments are made properly, it should be able to live off its investments into the foreseeable future.
Human ingenuity is limitless. You know, we always worry about something which did not happen. We'll find something.
Brunei's development is at the moment unsustainable. It needs to invest in other areas and quickly. Since the 1990s, alcohol, bars and nightclubs have been banned, so it's unlikely tourism can ever gain a foothold. Because of its incredible wealth and tiny population, Bruneians have a very good standard of living, enjoy free education and healthcare, and pay no personal income tax. The average household has 3 cars, so very few people ask questions of their Sultan or the future. They're enjoying their present situation too much.
It's an oasis of calm. Many people like to be in Brunei, like to work in Brunei, because it is a calm place. It's a very friendly and welcoming place. It hasn't suffered excesses of many of the other states.
Because life is so good, the Sultan and the royal family are genuinely loved by most people in Brunei.
What made the royal family of Brunei very, very popular, I think for obvious reason, is that they're being human, or they're being themselves. And if you look around, when the royal family move about in Brunei, there is minimum security that shows how safe and how well loved they are. And that is why the closeness of the people and the Sultan is really very evident.
The question is, how has the Sultan of Brunei survived as the last absolute monarch in Asia, where power is completely centralized in his hands? To understand his preeminent position, one has to examine the history of Brunei's sultans and the seminal events of 1962, when an armed rebellion almost overthrew the monarchy. Brunei Bay was an important port from the 9th century, as traders from China and the Middle East used it as a landing point and a place to buy important jungle goods.
The history of Southeast Asia is, in its earlier centuries, based upon what we call thalassocracies. These are kingdoms of the sea, if you like, not control of the land, but the control of trade routes and of the more desirable objects of trade.
The first Sultan was said to be Alak Batata, who reigned from 1363 and took the name Sultan Muhammad. He married into the royal family of Johor and embraced Islam. At the time, as still exists today, Bruneians lived on the sea in water villages to escape the stifling heat of dry land. Subsequent sultans built Brunei's first mosques and preached strict adherence to Islam. The sultans were revered by the people.
It becomes almost an act of sacrilege to criticize the Sultan in a situation, because he has got this aura about him, which I think has been handed down to the generations. His support is reinforced by the palaces and by the wealth and by all the prestige objects and all the ceremony that goes with it.
During the 15th and 16th centuries, through warfare and trade, Brunei built an empire that covered Borneo and parts of southern Philippines.
There were two famous kings, Sultan Bolkiah. He was known as Nakoda Ragam, the man who goes on the boat singing. And he, plus the ninth Sultan, Sultan Hassan, they were the people who actually known in Brunei history for having caused this expansion.
From the 16th century, Brunei's history became dominated by the arrival of European seafarers. First the Portuguese, then Spanish, and finally the British.
We have a positive evidence by Anthony Pigafetta, who was in Magellan's fleet, Italian, who came to Brunei, and he left a very vivid account. And he speaks about Brunei people drinking in golden cup and wearing a very expensive gown. And plus, he was treated for 54-course meal. Brunei reached this opulence mostly through trading means.
It was the importance of establishing and maintaining the spice trade that made the country a tactically important place for the Europeans. While the Spanish failed to overrun Brunei, the British arrived in the 18th century looking to get a foothold in the bay to keep their trade routes open. By this time, Brunei's empire was in decline. Brunei sultans found themselves sandwiched between competing and expanding interests on Borneo. After a succession crisis in 1828, Omar Ali Saifuddin II became the 21st Sultan of Brunei. He executed members of his own family who had claimed the throne, but it was the British he needed to be more concerned about.
The British presence began to be felt not as a result of British government interest at first, but because of James Brooke, who was an adventurer, a freebooter, who came and made a deal with a Brunei aristocrat to take control over Kuching, which later became the nucleus of his kingdom-to-be of Sarawak.
In 1842, James Brooke became governor of the British colony of Sarawak, west of Brunei. And for the next 100 years, Brunei's history was dominated by the Brooke family, who became known as the White Rajas.
Brunei was on the point of disappearing when the Raja Brooke was very active, coupled with the mismanagement of Brunei. It was shrinking, a lot of corruption and ineptitude, which made the people turn against the rulers. So Raja Brooke was welcomed as a savior.
By this time, the British had established a diplomatic link with Brunei, and the British felt that it was not in their interest, perhaps, to allow James to actually take over entirely, but also they felt it was a matter of honour to protect Brunei from further loss of territory.
Brunei was in danger of disappearing off the map altogether. Charles Brooke, nephew of James and now a renegade Raja, sailed up the Limbang River in Brunei and claimed the territory as his own.
Yeah, his ultimate aim, once he started, he got the taste of it. He wanted one day to finish off Brunei and bring it under his rule.
In 1888, Sultan Hashim signed a protectorate agreement with Britain that ensured Brunei would continue to exist, however small.
The sultans those days was really hard up. There was not much money. I think they welcomed the presence of the British as a stabilizing force at that time.
To establish what was to be done with Brunei, the British sent an envoy, Malcolm MacArthur, to write a report on the governance of Brunei and how the territory could be maintained.
He wrote a report, interesting report in 1904 called MacArthur Report. He had two options. He argued Brunei, of course, can be taken over by Sarawak. But he said doing that will be a great travesty of justice, because like England, Brunei is also under ancient monarchy. So it's not fair to snuff out that monarchy. Second reason his problem was that Brunei was so poverty-ridden at the time that it's very hard to maintain it. So that's another reason why Brunei should be handed over to Sarawak.
MacArthur won a lot of friends in Brunei with his sensitivity to the sultans and their position in society. However, he called impoverished Brunei a collection of ruinous hovels, where even Sultan Hashim wore threadbare clothes and had fallen through the floorboards of his palace on stilts.
MacArthur's mission was to find out just basically what to do with Brunei. Honour required that the Sultan be well treated and respected. There was some feeling that the Brooks were too grasping and perhaps in the long run unpredictable.
He wanted to preserve the remaining part of Brunei, provided that Britain can impose a kind of hegemony over Brunei, not by direct rule, by a form of indirect rule, where they appointed a British resident who was the advisor to the Sultan. But the real powers were in the hands of the British resident. So that was how Brunei was saved. In my writings, I say MacArthur was the real savior of Brunei.
The British had already established a successful residential system in the Federated Malay States. Having resisted the temptation of selling off Brunei to Charles Brooke, Sultan Hashim died in 1906, having saved his beloved kingdom. MacArthur became the first resident and set about creating a new system of government and taxation, whilst the Sultan was left in charge of religious affairs.
The resident takes over all the strings of the administration. He becomes the governor in effect. And the Sultan, usually under these treaties, the Sultan had to accept all his so-called advice, whatever he advised, which meant really the Sultan had lost his autonomy.
The British established themselves at the House of 12 Roofs, a building disused since 1984 when the British left. Today, it is a poignant reminder of Brunei's recent colonial past. Due to the death of his father, Jamalul Alam, in 1924, Ahmad Tajuddin became Sultan of Brunei at the age of just 11. With a minor on the throne, it was no surprise that the British were making most of the decisions for the country. The British effectively modernized Brunei, but compared with the rest of Asia, the country was relatively poor. This was about to change dramatically. Shell's discovery of oil in 1929 meant the country's roads, railways, and housing were built at an incredible rate. By 1936, the country's debts had been paid off. From nowhere, Brunei became the third biggest oil exporter in the Commonwealth. But Sultan Tajuddin wasn't personally seeing any of the oil money.
Nothing went to the Sultan at the time because according to the residency agreement, he was entitled for a monthly stipend. Say for example, 6,000 Straits dollars. They were not given direct money and only some profits, 20 to 30% was passed on, and the profits were not directly passed to the royalty. It was kept separate accounts managed by the resident and his assistant.
Until 1950, the Sultans of Brunei played second fiddle to the British residents. All this changed when Tajuddin's half-brother, Omar Ali Saifuddin III, acceded to the throne.
From the very first day of his accession, Omar Ali Saifuddin was keen to take control and reverse the historical process since 1905, which had seen power concentrated in the hands of the resident.
He started slowly taking away the powers and authority from the hands of the residents. And he knew the power of Brunei at that time. And he did not want the British to completely dictate terms to him as far as money is concerned.
Brunei's oil revenues were growing at a staggering rate, from $1 million in 1946 to $30 million by 1959. With some of this wealth, Omar Ali built a majestic mosque named after himself, which is still the most magnificent building in the country. Its main dome is said to be made from real gold. The 1950s saw the development of nationalist and democratic feelings in Brunei. The British were keen for Brunei to join neighbouring Sabah and Sarawak in the newly formed Malaysia.
They didn't want to leave behind an anachronism, an absolute monarchy in the midst of Southeast Asia, which, for one thing, the British thought would be very vulnerable to communist takeover.
Sultan Omar Ali was offered an inducement by the new Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Tunku Abdul Rahman came around and said, I'm going to make you the king of Malaysia. If you join Malaysia, who wouldn't want to be? You know, you preside over the rest of the sultans, and why not? I think he was quite persuaded to join Malaysia on those terms, yeah? But then Tunku Abdul Rahman went back to Malaya and consulted the rulers. And the rulers said, no way, man.
In the late 1950s, the Brunei People's Party had formed under the leadership of Ahmad Azahari, a radical who was pushing the British and the Sultan to hold elections and form a constitutional monarchy.
Azahari wanted to go too fast. Basically, Sir Omar Ali Saifuddin was sympathetic, but at the same time, he was a practical man. He still wanted to make sure that Brunei's future will be safeguarded, the wealth won't be squandered.
In 1961, the Sultan finally agreed to elections, and Azahari's People's Party won 54 out of the 55 seats to the Legislative Council.
When they won the landslide, the question then was, should the council, the Legislative Assembly, be convened in order to allow them to pass an anti-Malaysia resolution? So when finally, after weeks and weeks of tension, the date for the first Legislative Assembly meeting was fixed, it was then postponed. The resolution that they were going to talk about was not allowed, and it appeared to the People's Party that the Sultan and the resident were responsible for refusing to allow this anti-Malaysia resolution to be debated.
For Azahari, who believed he had the support of Indonesia behind him, it was the final straw.
Well, from the beginning I was against the Federation of Malaysia, because this is not actually a federation. This is a transfer of power from one colonial power to another. We are not rebels actually, but we are independent lovers and freedom lovers and adhere of the principle of democracy.
On December 8, 1962, to everyone's surprise, Azahari declared independence for Brunei and led an armed rebellion against the Sultan. No one had seen it coming.
I sent out a small piece saying the rebellion had broken out in Brunei to Reuters. See, they came back and say again, please.
The British moved quickly to mobilize their Gurkhas and Royal Commandos stationed in Singapore.
Suddenly somebody rolled up in a Land Rover and said, back to camp, we fly at dawn, Brunei's been invaded by the rebels, we've got to go and liberate the town.
It's a mystery why the rebellion broke out. Azahari, until his death, did not acknowledge the fact that he was the cause of the rebellion. He said this was engineered by some other factors in order to suppress him.
What I can tell you is that so deep was the corruption there that I saw it, so bad was the governance, that although I was a British soldier serving my Queen and serving my flag in countering the rebels and recapturing Brunei, I was very conscious even at that age that if I had been a Bruneian there, I'd have been with the rebels.
Armed revolt was a cock-up, really. It was ill-advised timing. It broke up and they were not organized, they didn't know where to go, what to do, and it was a complete chaos.
The following morning we did the assaults on Limbang, in which 5 of my colleagues were killed and 5 were wounded, and I did the assault on Laos in the 5th Division of Sarawak. And we went off to rescue, in inverted commas, the district officer and found that he was a rather large gin-sodden man with I like to think of him with a pink gin in his hand, but I think he only had a Webley revolver, who had in fact been surrounded by the rebels threatening his life, and he'd gone out and said, "I am the representative of Her Majesty the Queen, surrender," and they all did.
By the 20th of December, the rebellion was over. The Sultan declared a state of emergency, something that surprisingly still exists today. A paranoia set in that has lasted for almost 60 years.
Sultan Omar Ali was a unique gentleman, and he believed in the people quite a bit until the rebellion. That sort of changed his whole outlook. Yeah, he became sort of paranoid because he trusted his people so much, and he felt that they turned around him and let him down quite badly.
Only 40 rebels had been killed in the uprising and 2,000 captured. They would have been pardoned if they swore allegiance to the Sultan. Some refused. They would spend the next 20 years in jail. In 1962, a democratic experiment by Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin III went horribly wrong. When elections didn't go his way, he disbanded the legislature and sparked a rebellion that came without warning. In just 12 days, the uprising had been quashed. Many believe it was Brunei's incredible reserves from the export of oil that were at the heart of the rebellion, and the reason Brunei has not had meaningful elections since.
At that time, I mean, people of Brunei were all, many of them were taxi drivers and laborers, and how could you give democracy? How could you hold elections? How could you give power to these people? They would have made a mess of it. They already made a mess of the rebellion. Now, you're talking about $19 billion. I admire the Sultan because, I mean, if I had this kind of money at my beck and call, I would go crazy most probably.
In the mid-1960s, the British government was urging the Sultan to introduce elections and allow Brunei to become independent.
The British wanted the Sultan to move forward to self-government, but it had to be democratic self-government. They wanted him to become a constitutional monarch.
The Sultan, however, was reticent. He feared without a British presence in Brunei, the country was susceptible to attack from hostile neighbors. But at the same time, Omar Ali wanted the British to grant him full control of the country's finances.
Eventually, British fenced him in, you know, they have nowhere to go, yeah? So he said, look, he said, if you don't do that, I'm going to go, you know, I'm going to abdicate. That did not move Whitehall at all. So you want to go, you go. You know?
The Sultan surprised everyone by suddenly announcing his abdication in 1967 in favor of his firstborn son, Hassan al-Bolkiah. One theory was that his son was set to fail his military education in Britain, and it was a way of avoiding the embarrassment.
I can tell you the official reason. Sultan Omar believed that his young son should be given a proper training in statecraft. And he had enough because he founded the kingdom, he spent money, and he promulgated the constitution. And with the British, he defeated the rebellion. And he has a very good son who could really take over him.
He will have been told, no doubt, that he was going to take over the reins of government and at least going to learn how to be a sultan. But although that was what his father was saying, the history of the next few years, up until 1984, or even later, shows that the old man, the abdicated sultan, had no intention whatsoever of handing over.
At just 22, Hassan al became the Sultan in an elaborate coronation ceremony in 1968. Symbolically, it was his father, Sultan Omar Ali, who placed the solid gold crown on his son's head. His father was to remain the power behind the throne. In his early years, the current Sultan earned a reputation as being bored by his position of power.
Before long, he found that it was a very easy life with no responsibilities except to appear at ceremonial occasions. Whenever the Sultan appeared with these dark glasses and with the peaked cap pulled down over his eyes, it may well be that he just arrived back from Manila or Bangkok and had a hangover.
The 1970s saw the remarkable rise in the price of oil, from $1 a barrel in 1970 to $11 a barrel by 1974. Brunei's wealth went through the roof. With the discovery of gas as well as oil, the country soon had the highest per capita income in all of Asia.
During this period, quite a lot of welfare activities are going on, and quite a lot of money has been spent. Housing sector. All the Bruneians are entitled to free education, and you can see the development generally in the country, infrastructure like road system, electrical system. It has taken over by leaps and bounds.
However, the state of emergency imposed after the 1962 rebellion remained in place, and the constitution suspended. In 1975, the United Nations called on Brunei to embrace elections and become independent from the British. But the Sultan's father was still resolutely against both ideas. Brunei was seen as an anachronism, the last absolute monarchy in Asia.
When Hassanal Bolkiah came to power, everybody looked at him, oh my God, I mean, Sir Omar is gone. What shall we do? I mean, can this guy do it? And it took a little bit of time for the present Sultan to stand up on his own legs and imprint his image on the political situation, on the power.
In 1981, Hassanal enraged his father by marrying a commoner as his second wife. He became more conservative as he had fallen in love for the first time. Sultan Hassanal began taking his religion more seriously, and Brunei took on an increasingly Islamic atmosphere. The country becoming proud of its history, but also its faith. In 1984, Brunei finally agreed to become fully independent from Britain. Membership to ASEAN, the Commonwealth, and the United Nations followed soon after. By January 1984, the British residency system, in operation since 1906, formally came to an end. The country became known as Brunei Negara Darussalam, an abode of peace, and the Sultan became Prime Minister and Defense Minister. His brothers occupied the other positions of power. The royal family now had complete control of the country. They became untouchable. With independence in 1984, Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah assumed complete control of Brunei. The enormous state reserves that had been controlled by the British were suddenly at his mercy.
The question for the Sultan and his family was how to get real control, not mediated by a finance officer. They wanted to exercise direct control themselves.
Sir Omar Ali Saifuddin, so at that time, before the independence, he had accounted for every cent Brunei had. They were all invested with the Crown agent. Every year, the Legislative Council would meet and Brunei's accounts was read out. So there was no hanky-panky going on there. But the whole thing happened after the independence. There was a change.
The Sultan took full control, forming the Brunei Investment Agency and putting his brother Prince Jeffrey in charge. The country's finances became a state secret.
It was necessary to find some legitimate procedure whereby money could be allocated to the royal family without going through any kind of legislative process. And the mechanism that was found was charged expenditure.
With an expenditure account outside of the national budget, it was harder to know how much of the oil revenue actually went to the royal family.
The Brunei auditor, an Englishman, tried at one point to carry out an audit. He wasn't let in through the grill. They wouldn't let him into the offices of the investment agency.
The distinction between his own wealth and the state became so blurred, he was listed as the richest man in the world. The state's assets, all their reserves, were effectively his own. The Sultan's spending became the stuff of legend. His car collection alone was said to include 500 Rolls-Royces and hundreds of other classic cars. For his own personal use, he had a jumbo jet customized with gold fittings, believed to be worth $233 million. To the outside world, he was the king of bling. He built the biggest palace in the world, the Istana Nurul Iman, its gold dome towering above the Brunei River and the water villages below. Every year for the Muslim festival of Hari Raya, the Sultan opens the doors of the palace to his subjects, and over 100,000 people receive food and gifts from the sovereign. Because of his incredible spending, the Sultan gained a reputation that put Brunei on the map. Only Hassanal and his brother Prince Jeffrey knew the state of Brunei's finances.
The lack of transparency as to where the money is going and where it's coming from, I think, is a major problem for the period. The great expenditure, the lavish expenditure, has fallen into some sort of disrepute, if you like.
Discussing money and how much money the Sultan has became a no-go subject.
Talking about wealth, Brunei's money is a taboo in this country. It's constitutionally banned.
The centralized financial system set up after independence was open to abuse. But the Sultan could have never imagined it would later be his own brother who would be accused of stealing from state coffers. In 1984, the Brunei government decided to introduce a philosophy known as MIB in Malay, which encouraged people to believe in the three pillars of Brunei's system: Malay, Muslim, and monarchy.
MIB is a yardstick, behavioral parameter for people to observe certain rules, that's all.
They think if you are a true Malay, if you are a true Muslim, and if you believe in monarch, you will behave well. Because government is involved, it sounds like propaganda.
People are indoctrinated in the benefits and the virtues of MIB. It's now taught through schools, it's taught in the university, and people are constantly reminded that that is the blueprint to which they should try to conform.
Brunei isn't 100% Malay, nor 100% Muslim. Chinese workers make up a sizable proportion of the population. So this ideology precludes them, although the government claim it is inclusive. MIB as a philosophy is largely symbolic.
This symbolism has been important for projecting the image of the Sultan as a man of God, even though in his private life, when he goes abroad, he may not be behaving quite up to the level of the Islamic ruler.
To reinforce the increasingly Islamic atmosphere in Brunei, in 1991, the country went officially dry. Bars and nightclubs were closed down, and alcohol was banned. Sultan Hassanal was establishing the cult of personality, so beloved of totalitarian regimes.
Brunei is similar to a totalitarian regime. It's similar to what one has read about Germany, Nazi Germany, and the communist Soviet Union. It feels like what you imagine those countries would have been like If you are part of it, and I have been employed there, it is totalitarian, and the way that they manipulate and control. One also noticed how there was a constant stream of propaganda on the television, supporting the monarchy, supporting the Islamic religion and so on. But there was this pervasive sense of fear.
In such a climate, there is no opposition to the regime. In fact, to even talk ill of the Sultan was deemed an offense, even if you're related to him.
There are some taboo subjects we're not supposed to write about, which is religion, sex, the government, and the Sultan as well, and members of the royal family. I think this is for security reasons as well, and for the harmony of the country.
You don't touch the royal family or the Sultan. You don't abuse them. As a newsman, I can say that. We have more freedom of the press in Brunei, I can tell you this much, than in Malaysia or Singapore.
I did cover a royal wedding before, and I got a call from the Prime Minister's office, and they told me that, yes, you can talk about this and that. Don't try to talk about the wife, which is the Sultan's daughter. That kind of thing, like, maybe the food that she eats or something. That still bemused me in a bit, especially when I was interviewing, it was the son-in-law of His Majesty.
In the 1990s, political activity became non-existent, and what parties were allowed to continue had almost no membership and couldn't say anything about the Sultan's power. In 1997, the scandal of Prince Geoffrey's spectacular spending hit the headlines. He was Minister of Finance and had a reputation as a playboy, blowing millions through his own company on projects that he's alleged to have put in his personal name and not that of the country. The Sultan filed legal proceedings against his brother, then dropped them when he realized just how embarrassing the scandal would be. Geoffrey's extravagant purchases were put up for auction.
2,400, 2,400, 2,005, 531.
Prince Geoffrey's two most famous projects were built next door to each other. When it first opened, Jerudong Park attracted upwards of 5,000 people every day. Now it's been left to decay, and on average, less than 200 people visit daily. The second project was one of the world's most expensive hotels, the $1 billion 600-room Empire, with real gold leaf lining the walls and suites costing up to $14,000 a night.
It was said to be a project which would need to be filled nightly for something like 100 years in order to pay back the investment. It was a hotel, and Brunei hasn't got a very lively tourist trade, and most of the tourists who come would not be able to afford to stay in a hotel like that.
Like Jerudong, the Empire is barely used and has created a vast black hole in Brunei's finances. Brunei is littered with projects began by Prince Geoffrey and never completed.
He was so ambitious. And what's happening in Dubai now, it also happened in a small way in Brunei, because Prince Geoffrey started to build a lot of palaces, a lot of flats and a lot of dream buildings, which was useless for Brunei.
He was accused by the Sultan of embezzling $15 billion from the country's accounts.
The scandals relating to the use of money in the past weakened the prestige of the monarchy.
Prince Geoffrey described himself as the fall guy for his family's excesses.
I'm sure the Sultan felt deeply betrayed by Geoffrey, and he must have realized that he, the Sultan, had a sort of character flaw, that he had been too trusting. He trusted international opportunists such as Khashoggi, El Fayed, but it had never damaged him. However, in the case of his own brother, I think he was really made to realise how careless and over-trusting he had been, and I think it must have had a deep effect on him.
Brunei suffered in the Asian economic downturn of the late 90s. From being a country with incredible reserves and a budget surplus, it suddenly found itself dangerously low on funds. The era of superspending came to an end. The Sultan became much more circumspect about money. He also took over from his brother as Minister of Finance, unable to trust anyone else with the state funds.
We should go back to more transparency where Brunei's wealth is concerned. We must know where the money is going, where it's being invested, what is being done. And unless we do that, there's going to be problems like Prince Jeffrey misusing the funds.
In 2004, the Sultan declared himself infallible and immune from prosecution. Freed of Brunei's colonial masters, today his grip on power knows no bounds.
Brunei has been very good to Britain. We're doing a lot of work to help and support their armed forces. So Brunei is regarded as being a friend of Britain, but whether Brunei under the Sultan is a friend of British values, of democracy, freedom, and the ability to express your views is, I think, a rather different question.
The Sultan has survived for over 4 decades on the throne. Many can't imagine a day when he won't be around.
His Majesty is a father, a leader, a friend, and most importantly, a Bruneian. So His Majesty is all of that, So whatever the people feel, he can also feel it.
What he has done for the country, I'm really impressed, And sometimes I wish that he stays longer as the Sultan, for as long as possible as well. And mind you, he's been running the country for 40 years. And I'm always impressed that, the international relationship that he has with other countries is very strong.
In recent interviews, the Sultan has admitted that the current system of absolute control can't go on forever.
He knows that things must change. And he said, when the time comes, I will change as well.
I think that there will be some steps towards a constitutional monarchy in due course. There has to be some public participation in government.
For the moment, the last absolute monarchy in Asia appears secure. Its people content to keep things just as they are.
We're all accustomed to the political system right now. If it was to change, it will really shake up Brunei a bit.
For the foreseeable future, I think that Bruneians would say, yeah, we've got a good lifestyle. It's a nice place to live. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yeah.
Brunei monarchy has been a good influence. With the present Sultan, the past Sultan, it's the best thing which have happened to Brunei.
The man Bruneians simply call HM is a benevolent ruler who genuinely wants the best for his people, a population entirely beholden to him, and his iron grip on power. Can his dynasty survive when oil is finite and a new, more vocal generation move into positions of power? How long can politics be put on hold? These are questions that only the Sultan can answer. For the moment, he and his people, it seems, are content with the status quo.